show you some methods that you can use to compare and order fractions. To compare and order fractions, you can follow these steps. Find the least common denominator of the fractions. That is, find the least common multiple of the two denominators. Then, write an equivalent fraction for each one using the LCD, or the least common denominator. Then, all you have to do once you have equivalent fractions with a common denominator is to compare the numerators. Let me show you what I mean. Take a look at this example here. If we want to compare 5/8 and 7/12, the first thing we should do is see if we can answer the question, see if we can compare them using what we already know about what fractions mean, what fractions look like. For example, you know 5/8, that's pretty close to a half. Half of 8 is 4, so this fraction is just a little bit more than 1/2. Same thing with 7/12. You know that half of 12 is 6, and 7 is just a little bigger than 6, so this is just a little bigger than a half also. So we can't really compare them by just comparing them to a half. Sometimes you can compare fraction to a whole, and you can tell which one is bigger or smaller. Sometimes you can see that one fraction is way closer to 0 than the other. When you've exhausted all of these methods, when you've compared them to a half, or to a whole, or maybe to 0, then the next method is what I'm about to show you, and that is to write an equivalent fraction with a common denominator. If we really want to know whether 5/8 or 7/12 are bigger, we need to actually find a common denominator. When I say common denominator, I mean a multiple of both 8 and 12. And we want to try to find the smallest number possible. The smallest multiple of both 8 and 12. And the easiest way to do that is to start with the larger denominator and to list multiples. This step becomes a thinking step later on, but as we start to practice, you might want to list out the multiples of 12 and 8. So we've got 12, 24, 36, and so on. I would start by writing about 3 to 5 multiples, and then look at the other number. If you know your 8 times tables, you're already probably ahead of me. Your 8 times tables, when you think of the multiples of 8, you've got 8, 16, 24, and so on. We don't even have to go any further because I now see a common multiple. 24 is a common multiple for 8 and 12. It's a number that both 8 and 12 go into evenly. Now that we've understood what multiples are and what common multiples are, let's write our equivalent fraction. So our equivalent fractions are going to now have 24 in the denominator, since both 12 and 8 go into 24. So now I need to write an equivalent fraction. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to ask myself, okay, well, 8 times 3 is 24. So I'm going to do the same thing to the 5. I'm going to multiply 5 times 3. In other words, I want to make this an equivalent ratio. However much I'm increasing the denominator, I must also do the same thing to the numerator. So 5 times 3 is 15. Now I'm going to do the same thing with this fraction. I'm going to ask myself, 12 times what gave me 24? And that is times 2. So I'm going to do 7 times 2. So my new numerator here is 14. I now see that 5/8 is equivalent to 15 over 24. If I multiply them both by 3, I get 15 over 24. 7/12 is equivalent to 14 over 24. I just multiplied by 2. Notice my denominators are now the same. They are now a common denominator. So I can now just simply compare the numerators. The top numbers. Well, this is 15/24, and this is 14/24. So 15/24 is greater than 14/24. So this method is, again, is calling finding a common denominator, writing an equivalent fraction. And then all you have to do, once you have an equivalent denominator, you just have to compare the numerators, or the top numbers in the fraction. Why don't you try? Make sure you've copied these notes, this example, and then I want you to try a few of these on your own. Take a look at these three. I want you to try these three problems. Use the example I just gave you. Make them a little bit bigger so you can see. Pause the video and unpause it when you're finished, and we'll go over them. Okay, let's start with this first one. A common denominator for 3 and 9 is 9. 3 and 9 both go into 9. So I'm going to first write my equivalent fractions. This one isn't going to change. If I'm not changing the denominator, then I'm not going to change the numerator. In other words, 9 times 1 is 9, so all I have to do is 4 times 1. This denominator isn't changing, so my numerator isn't changing. But 3 goes into 9. 9 is a common multiple here. So 3 times 3 is 9, so I'm going to do 3 times 2 to get my new numerator here. Now I have 6 ninths and 4 ninths, and 6 is greater than 4. So 2/3 is greater than 4 ninths. Did you do that one right? Let's look at this one. 12 and 8. A common denominator for 12 and 8. Now we know our times tables. What's the smallest number you can think of that both 12 and 8 go into? Hopefully you got 24. 12 times 2 is 24. 5 times 2 is 10. So my numerator here is changing to 10. Again, all I did was multiply by 2, because 12 times 2 is 24. Same thing over here. 8 times 3 is 24, so I'm multiplying this whole thing by 3. 7 times 3 is 21. And this is pretty easy to see that this is greater. This is much greater. Now this is an example of a problem that we really could have solved by just comparing the fractions to a half or a whole. Take a quick look. Half of 8 is 4. 7 is greater than 4, so this is more than a half. When you look at 12, half of 12 is 6. Since 5 is less than 6, this is less than a half. So this fraction is less than a half, this fraction is greater than a half. We could pretty much tell, without actually finding a common denominator, that 7/8 is greater than 5/12, or 5/12 is smaller than 7/8. Let's check this last one. A common denominator for 6 and 18. Even though you don't know your 18 times tables, you should know that 6 goes into 18 evenly. So 18 is our common denominator. Since I'm not changing my denominator, then I'm not going to change my numerator here. So 18 is staying 18, so the numerator is going to stay 5. This one, however, my denominator is getting multiplied by 3 to get 18, so I have to do 1 times 3 to get 3. Now that I have a common denominator, I simply compare the numerators, and I know that 3 is less than 5. So 1/6 is less than 5/18. How'd you do on those? Let's look at one more example, and this is a slightly different problem. In this one, we're going to order the fractions. We are going to try to figure out how to put 1/2, 9/14, 3/4, and 5/7 in order from least to greatest. So we've got to order them. First thing we can try to do is we can try to compare them to a half. We see this is a half. Half of 14 is 7, so this is greater than a half. Half of 4 is 2, so this is greater than a half. Half of 7, do you know what that is? It's actually 3.5, which means this is greater than a half. So I can already tell right away that this is going to be my smallest fraction. I could go ahead and write that in my answer. okay? But for these three, I can't really tell what comes first, second, and third, or in this case, second, third, and fourth. So I'm going to, again, find a common denominator. Now I'm going to go ahead and find a common denominator for all four of these. So now I need to find a number that goes 2, 14, 4, and 7 all go into evenly. I'm going to start with the biggest denominator, 14. And I'm going to start listing multiples for 14. I don't know my 14 times tables, but I can count by 14 by adding. So 14 times 1 is 14. 14 times 2 is 28. If you keep going, 14 times 3, that's going to give me 42. I'm going to stop there, and I'm going to now, since I've got 3 multiples, I'm going to try the 7s and the 4s and the 2s. And pause for a minute. You know your 2 times tables. You know your 4 times tables. And you should know your 7 times tables. Are any of these multiples also multiples of 7 and 4 and 2? Take a look. You might be thinking, oh yeah, 14. 14 is a multiple of 7. You're right. It's also a multiple of 2. But is it a multiple of 4? No. So 14 is not going to be our common denominator. How about 28? 14 is a multiple of 14. Any even number is a multiple of 2. Is 28 a multiple of 4? Yes, it is. You can list it out if you want. Your 4 times tables, if you list them out, 4, 8, 12, 16, 20, 24, there it is, 28. And again, 28 is a multiple of 7. If you know your 7 times tables, I'll list them out so you can see. Here it is. 4 times 7 is 28. So our smallest or least common denominator for all of these is going to be 28. So I'm going to change all my denominators to 28. Now remember, whenever you change the denominator, you're going to have to change the numerator by multiplying by the same numbers. Okay, so let's see if we can do these quickly by using our times tables. Okay, and this becomes easier the more you practice. All right, 2 times 14 is 28. So I'm going to have to do 1 times 14, which is 14. 14 times 2 is 28. So 9 times 2 is 18. 4 times 7 is 28. So 3 times 7 is 21. 7 times 4 is 28. So 5 times 4 is 20. Now that I have a common denominator, all my denominators are the same. All I have to do is simply look at my numerators and order them. We already knew 14, we already knew 1/2 was going to be the smallest. And here we see the next smallest is 9/14. So let's write our answer here, and let's go back to the original numbers. Then it looks like 20 comes next. That's smaller than 21. So I'm going to write 5/7. And then my greatest fraction here is actually this one. See, 21 is the biggest, 21/28. And that's 3/4. So my final answer is 1/2, 9/14, 5/7, and 3/4. I was able to order these fractions by finding a common denominator, then writing equivalent fractions, then simply comparing the numerators. I'd like you to try one more problem, and then we'll be finished with this lesson for today. I want you to try to put these 4 fractions in order from least to greatest. I want you to try this on your own, and we're going to go over similar problems again tomorrow. Pause the video, and then we'll go over it. Okay, hopefully you've had a chance to try these. A common denominator for 2, 6, 3, and 5. There are more, by the way, there's more than one common denominator, but you want to try to find the smallest one. I'm going to start with the biggest number here, 6, and if I think of my 6 times tables, 6, 12, 18, 24, 30, Okay, I had to go a little ways because I was then thinking of my next biggest number, which is 5, and I know that 5 doesn't go into 6, 12, 18, or 24, but it does go into 30, so I'm going to check the others. Does 3 go into 30? Yes, it does. Does 2 go into 30? Yes, it does. 2 goes into any even number. So hopefully you found your common denominator is 30. So now I'm going to write my equivalent fractions. I'm going to rewrite all of these fractions as a denominator out of 30. So 2 times 15 is 30. So 1 times 15 is 15. 6 times 5 is 30. So 5 times 5 is 25. 3 times 10 is 30. So 2 times 10 is 20. 5 times 6 is 30. So 3 times 6 is 18. I hope you see how I'm finding these numerators. I'm just multiplying whatever I multiplied the bottom by to get my common denominator, I'm multiplying the top. Remember, whatever you do to the denominator, you do to the numerator. Now I can compare them from least to greatest. I see that 15 is the smallest. That was 1/2. I'm going to write them back in their original form. 18 is the next smallest. That was 3/5. Then we have 20. That's the next one in our order, and that was 2/3. And it looks like this is my biggest or greatest fraction, and that was 5/6. Hopefully you did well on that one. Bring your notes and your examples to class tomorrow, and I'll see you then.